Now, I want to talk about California and follow Ed's discussion of demographics. I've been talking for some time about how California, because of the rapid growth in employment here, has been approaching full employment, and we've had a forecast that California would achieve full employment sometime in the early part of 2017. And what I want to do in this talk today is follow the methodology that Ed went through, without all of the detail, kind of move towards the answers of using that methodology as it applies to California and see how that informs us about full employment. And before I start, just kind of a comment on full employment. You know, we're interested in full employment because that means that everyone who wants a job at current wages can have a job, except those, there may be people searching for jobs, so you might have that kind of churn. And that sounds like a good thing. It also means that labor markets are tight, and therefore we have increasing wages, better standards of living. So all good things. One of the things that full employment does in terms of a forecast is it means that economic growth is going to slow down, because when you have unemployment, you have this pool of labor, and that pool of labor can be drawn upon to grow faster than the labor force, faster than the population will allow. So we need to know something about when we're in the neighborhood of full employment, because that means that our forecast should be for slower economic growth, except if you have migration. So California, during some parts of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, was a kind of full employment economy, but grew much faster because we had very rapid migration from other parts of the country into California. Today, because of the cost of living in California, and in particular the cost of housing, that migration kind of isn't going to happen. So when we think about California being close to full employment, we're thinking about an economy which is where we want it to be, but an economy that's going to be growing slower. And the reason why I bring that up is that you hear on the radio, well, the California economy is slowing down. Sounds like a bad thing. Not if it's slowing down because we're at full employment. So let's see what all of that means in terms of the California economy. First, I want to do an employment retrospective, then look at demographics and how those demographics actually show us closing the gap to full employment, and then look very briefly at a couple of items that are supporting California growth: housing starts and commercial real estate. And relative to our theme today is commercial real estate at its peak with respect to California. Good shipments, and that'll lead us to the forecast. So let's just start with employment. What you see on this graph here are two lines. The bottom line is payroll jobs. And so that's taken at the establishment level, and the question is how many people are employed on payrolls, which means that if somebody has multiple jobs, they're counted multiple times in this. You can see on the left-hand side, you get that hump there. That is the peak in 2007, drops in the recession, and then starts growing, and it's been growing at rates greater than the U.S. to where we're now 6% above the previous peak. So we're at record levels of payroll jobs. The top line is what's called the household survey. It is a survey of people who are employed. It counts number of people, not number of jobs. This is where we get our unemployment numbers from. And one of the differences between these two is it also counts people who are not on payrolls, but are self-employed or 1099 contract workers, farm workers, and the like. And that kind of is very much correlated with payroll employment and is 6.2% above. More than 18 million Californians are now employed. So we're at record levels of employment, have been growing faster than the U.S. and faster than our population, but that's because we've had this pool of unemployed who firms have been able to draw on and bring into employment. And by sector, this growth is pretty widespread. On the right-hand side, you see the sectors that are contracting. The one on the far right, that's petroleum extraction, primarily in Kern County, a little bit in Los Angeles County. And then manufacturing are the other two, durable and non-durable goods. They've been shrinking in employment even as manufacturing in California has been expanding. So these are Ed's robots creating goods rather than people creating goods. The rest, as you look across, we have fairly widespread growth across sectors. The first one on the left is healthcare and social services. That on average is a lower paid sector, although we don't know whether it's the higher paid or the lower paid jobs that have been added over the last year. The next is leisure and hospitality, also lower paid sector. But then the next three, construction, education, and professional, scientific, and technical services, are higher wage sectors. And those three add up to about the same amount as the first two. So we've got kind of a nice mix there. Another way to view this, because this is number of jobs, is how fast are these sectors growing. And this chart shows you the percentage growth by sectors. The first one over on the left, which is good paying jobs on average, growing at 7%, is construction. So that relates directly to what we're going to talk about today, because that's an important driver in the increase employment in California. And then we get leisure and hospitality, lower paid, professional, scientific, and technical services, higher paid, healthcare and social services, lower paid. So really kind of a nice mix. And that mix is one that you don't find in many places in the U.S., which is why California's income levels have been growing faster than the U.S. as well. So that's the sectoral distribution. Geographically, we used to be talking about a bifurcated economy, an east-west economy. Well, it's still the case that San Francisco and Silicon Valley, in spite of high housing prices, in spite of a constrained labor force, is growing fast. It's growing at 4% for both of those. Those are the two on the left. That's more than double the U.S. rate. The U.S. is there in rust brown. And what's kind of interesting here is you hear about the unicorns being starved for cash and laying off people. Well, in a labor market as hot as the Bay Area labor market, they're just kind of being soaked up. That does not seem to be a real issue in terms of growth in California. But then you get the Inland Empire, then Orange County, San Diego, and Ventura, Sacramento and the Delta, San Joaquin Valley, Los Angeles, East Bay, Mid-Coast, widespread growth throughout California. So geographically dispersed now as opposed to this real east-west divide. The only kind of divide is over on the right there, the great state of Jefferson up north. And I used to say that, well, you know, in November when we have the election and their primary product is legalized, that they'll start growing faster. But some friends of mine yesterday informed me that they didn't think that was the case, that that's not going to be a big enough boost for this part of the state, the northern part of the state, which is losing population and certainly on the decline. But most of the state, and where more than 90% of the state's population lives, growing faster than the U.S. So let's turn to demographics and see what this means about full employment. And what you see on this graph is the distribution of population. This is California Department of Finance estimates, distribution of population by 5-year age groups. And let's look first on the right-hand side of the graph, what I've just circled there. Those are baby boomers who are in their 50s. So they're going to be aging out of the workforce, kind of moving every year. They're going to move one to the right. The next group to look at are the millennials in their 20s. That's not all of the millennials, but millennials in their 20s. And they're moving into their 30s and moving into this prime working age. But notice what happens in the middle. The group that has the highest participation in the labor force, the highest employment ratios, is in the middle. It's that 35 to 50 age group. And that's the Gen Xers. And they're a smaller cohort than either of the two cohorts on either on the sides of them. And that's going to have a real impact on what full employment is in California. So if we just plot the employment to population ratio, this is a little different from what you saw for the national, because this starts at age 18 and goes to age 64. But there's a definite downward trend there that we've been seeing, and the dip at the right-hand side, that's the Great Recession. We've been coming up from that. kind of rolling over a little bit, but coming up, but not quite at the 2007 levels, which are represented by that dashed line. So coming up towards that. So if you think of 2007 as a time when we were at full employment, the employment to population ratio of this prime working age group is not quite there. And this is where you get, well, at current rates of job growth, we'll be there in 2017. But if instead what you do is take account of the different numbers of Californians in each age group and the fact that they have different employment to population ratios, that is a different propensity to be in the labor force and to get a job, you get a point over on the right, and I'm just going to draw a straight line from 2007 across, a point on the right that is almost where we are today. In fact, that gap is so small that at current rates of job growth, we're there next month in July. So we are right now in the neighborhood of full employment. And you remember the implication of that is that that means that economic growth in California is going to slow down. Not a bad thing. It's in fact a good thing because we want to be near full employment, but that's the implication that you're going to see in the forecast. So let me now turn to a couple of items that support our forecast. And these are sort of important fundamentals. And the first is in construction. So we saw the construction growing at 7% a year. And the question is that still going to grow? Well, part of that, and a large part of that, is in residential building. And this graph shows you the number of permits issued in California in green. And today we are just about where we were in the late 1990s. So we've grown, but if you look at that gap below that red dashed line, you see we've been underbuilding. And we've had good job growth that supports family formation, that supports residential construction, and you see it in rents for apartments, and you see it in vacancy rates. So we have in the forecast continued growth in residential construction through this year into 2017, and that's the sort of light blue area to the right there. But then late 2017, 2018, it kind of flattens out at 10,000 units per month for a whole variety of reasons. So that's part of it. Another part of it is the use of labor in the construction of commercial real estate. And in conjunction with the law firm of Allen Matkins, we do a survey twice a year, and some of you may participate in this. It's a survey of developers, and the questions that we ask, among the questions we ask are, as you look forward to 2018, so 3 years ahead, what do you think real rental rates are going to do? What do you think vacancy rates are going to do? And from that, we develop an index of developer sentiment. And that index is then parsed out by markets. We have 6 markets that we survey, and it's parsed out by type of commercial real estate. We're going to be releasing the survey and an analysis of the survey next month, so look for it. But I just wanted to give you a peek at what we have found so far in the office markets, because I think it's interesting and kind of reflective on our topic today. This is the office market developer sentiment, and the bars that you see there so they're in terms of time. The clusters are geographies, the bars are time, and they go from June 2014 as you move towards the right to June 2016. The first, and the dashed line there is at 50. Below 50 is pessimism, above 50 is optimism with respect to markets 3 years hence. Let me digress. Why 3 years hence? Well, if you're making a business plan for a commercial real estate project, you want to know what's going to happen 3 years and more in the future. And if you are pessimistic about that, then that means that projects aren't going to pencil and you're not going to do them. So that's what we're trying to capture here. The first 3 are Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego. And what you notice there is they're all above that dashed line. But there's a definite trend, a downward trend. So some of our panel of developers are beginning to get pessimistic about rental rates and about vacancy rates going forward 3 years. The next three are East Bay, Silicon Valley, and San Francisco. Same trend, but now turned to pessimism. So what this tells us is that, at least in the office market, there are going to be marginal projects that are not going to get done. And the level of construction of office buildings in the Bay Area is going to go down. And then the question is, when you roll all of that up with other forms of construction, including residential, do you get positive growth or negative growth? And what we have is positive growth, but not as much as we would have if this were still a hot market. So looking at one other piece of data before we turn to the forecast, I've shown in various conferences different measures of goods movement. And so that might be the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and Oakland. It's the international airports. And so today I'm going to show you one on the regional airports. And by the way, the trends in all of these look the same. So I'm just changing it for variety. This is Oakland Airport and Ontario Airport is goods movement. These are two airports that are dominated by package services such as UPS and FedEx. They both have an upward trend. There's nothing sort of worrisome there, except for that trend is pretty shallow. But it indicates slow continued growth in the movement of goods in California. So nothing there that would suggest that we've got a problem in maintaining growth. And so the implications of this is full employment will be there any day now. But that gives us slower growth in this constrained economy. We'll have a topping out in construction, perhaps, but certainly a topping out in office construction. But there are some risks, and one of the risks is that we have on the ballot basically making the tax surcharge on the highest income earners in California permanent by extending Prop 30 another 12 years. That increases the state's reliance on probably the most volatile tax base you can possibly find. And it means that any downturn is just going to be exacerbated in state finance with cutting of programs and budget crises. And then the second one I want to point out is in presidential politics. There's been a lot said about trade and trade wars. California is very dependent on trade with Mexico and trade with China. And if we have trade wars, it certainly means that we're not going to be staying at full employment, at least not during the initial days or years of those trade wars. So that brings me to the forecast. And our forecast is for growth in employment, but at slower rates, and for unemployment coming in at the end of the forecast period in 2018, not really significantly different from the U.S., with decent but not spectacular population growth and personal income growth that is going to be higher than the U.S. So that concludes California, and what I'd like to do now is turn it over to William Yu, who's going to talk about middle income and what has been happening there.